But first of all, I want to thank you all for coming along to probably one of the geekiest classes that is going to be at Tales this year. So congratulations on being the Uber nerds. Give yourself a round of applause. And I promise you it is pretty nerdy, and you get to taste some phenomenal liquid in the time being as well. And I think we have the Uberest of Uber nerds at the front here, Camper English, Ultra Geek. If you've, he's a new book out, is that right, Camper? Yep. What's it called? AKA That's a catchy title. Very long hashtag as well. What does it mean? Never mind. Okay, so first thing I have to tell you is that you are going to be tasting cask strength liquid. Woo! You do have water in front of you. We do encourage you to hydrate throughout the course of the next 90 minutes. Please, please, please do so. If you do require any assistance in getting to where you need to be after this, and you feel like you do need help, then talk to someone at the back who has a nice, kind face. Don't talk to any of us. Correct? Yes. Understood? Because we don't care. We do? We do. Especially Don. Look at him. All right. So first off, let me introduce our panelists in no particular order. They can give you a wee wave as we go along here. We have Dr. Don Livermore from Pernod. And I have a little spiel about each of them as well. So apparently Don was born in rural Canada. Is there anything else but rural Canada? Yeah. Everyone's so nice. Moved to Ontario as a microbiologist for Hiram Walker in 1996, as a MSc and PhD in brewing and distilling from Heriot Watt, which is in Edinburgh. And he's been with Hiram Walker for 20 years. All correct?
All correct.
I'm on a roll. And then we have Jourdan. Jourdan, like myself, is not a doctor, so he wanted me to point that out.
Yeah. Not a doctor.
He's also Canadian, although it doesn't stipulate if he came from a rural part.
We're sort of taking over.
There's a lot of Canadians in this room. I better dial back the Canadian jokes so I get my head kicked in. So he worked for 11 years in bars in both Canada and also Ireland. And he has been with Moet Hennessy as the Hennessy ambassador for 7 years. So a nice round of applause for Jourdan. And last, but by no means last, we have Dr. Matthew Crow over here. Nice round of applause. Matthew is head of wood science research at Diageo Scotland. It's a nice catchy title. Started work at Diageo 10 years ago, has worked in the blending teams and analytical teams, and worked on such boutique brands as Johnnie Walker and Oban, and it's pronounced Oban for 95% of the room who don't pronounce it correctly. It's not Oban, it's Oban, like open your mouth. Every day's a school day. And he is also festooned with letters. He has a PhD in chemistry, so I think we have a very worthy panel to geek you folks out, wouldn't you agree? And my name is Ewan. All right, that's it. So I'll give you a little preamble into why I wanted to do this seminar in the first place. And there should be, every good story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And this one might have a beginning and a middle, and hopefully an end. The end is up to you guys, because we do have a Q&A at the end of this. We do have some questions that we had sent in for us, quite a few of them. But we have left some time at the end, so hopefully everyone, apart from Camper, who's probably got about 4,000 questions already in his... Yep? Okay, good. Right. We do have questions, and we do have a hot mic, which will go around the room if you want to ask any questions. But do please hold them to the end, because we have quite a lot of information to get through. So I guess the beginning of this was I grew up in a distillery in Speyside in Scotland, and I grew up about 20 yards away from a warehouse, and it was all I really knew. So from being a baby up until the age of 16 when I started working in a distillery, all I smelt was maturation, and all I could smell was whiskey. But I didn't really understand anything other than it went into a barrel. Didn't really know why it went into a barrel. Didn't really care, to be perfectly honest. And it wasn't until I got a little bit older that I started to ask my dad, who also worked in distilling, and so did my granddad. I was like, so back then, did they realize why they put it into barrels? And he's just like, not really. They just knew that it made it taste better. And that was it. That was really kind of the extent of it. They knew that it went in clear, came out brown, and tasted better. Generally at different ages, depending on which distillery it came from or what kind of barrels it had gone into, and so on and so forth. And we're going to do a little bit more of a deep dive into that and look at where that formation of flavor comes from, and then also how we manipulate that flavor as well to end up with what you guys see in a finished product. And a lot of the blood, sweat, and tears that goes into creating these wonderful spirits. So we have some wonderful Canadian whiskey, some wonderful Scotch, and some really, really nice, wonderful cognac for you guys to try. Very rare samples, aren't they?
Yep. Yes.
They'll warm up, don't worry. The more you cheer, the more active they will get. So that's really where it came from. It's that understanding where that formation of flavor and that DNA that's inherent in all distilleries, and maintaining that consistency and maintaining that DNA, because a lot of work goes into it, and you really want that to come through in the final product. So that said, is everyone ready to get going? Don't forget, we have the election riggers next door, so a little louder, please. Much better. All right. Are you ready, Don?
I'm ready.
Good. He has a little bit of a sore throat, so if he sounds a little hoarse, there's a joke in there somewhere I can't be bothered explaining, but if he sounds a little hoarse, that is why. I'm going to pass it over to you now, sir.
Thank you very much, Ewan. I guess I got the symptoms of Tales of the Cocktail with losing my voice. Imagine that. Yes. I'm going to dial it up the seminar today. As soon as Ewan approached me earlier about talking about the chemistry of whiskey, oh boy. This is one of my favorite topics, and anyone who's had an opportunity to hear me speak before, I love it when we can get to dial it up into this science level. So I've been here at this distillery now for 20 years. This is the Hiram Walker Distillery right on the Detroit River there. We've been there since 1858, and we are probably one of the larger distilleries in North America. Currently inside of our inventories right now, we store 1.6 million barrels. And a lot of the things I'm going to talk about are components that are going to come out of our still house today, and that's the building there right in front of us. So without further ado, there's me. There. So Canadian whiskey is a little bit different than a lot of the other whiskey styles around the world. And a lot of times when I do tastings, I'll often say Canadian whiskey is sort of like the opposite of bourbon. What we do is we bring in grains here. We bring in corn, rye, barley, and wheat. We ferment them separately. We distill them separately. We age them separately. And then we put them together at the end. That's why they have a job like mine as a master blender. I'm continually developing recipes based off of these kind of things, and I'm all about where these flavors come from. If I was to use corn in a recipe, and most of Canadian whiskey indeed is made of corn, always has been, it usually gives you that nice, sweet, creamy perception inside of your whiskey. I like to call rye the DNA of Canadian whiskey. It's really that nice, spicy, clove, gingery, peppery flavor you got to. So if I want to dial that up, I'll often say that's the DNA, or that's the what we call is the Canadian hug. And that is that warm feeling going down through the chest. And generally, in terms of recipes, you'll get an idea how much rye is in a whiskey, just how long and length of finish we'll get. And we'll have an opportunity to try one here shortly. Wheat, I'll often say that's the Tim Hortons character. I know the Canadians in the room because of Tim Hortons. Tim Hortons is like the Dunkin' Donuts of the North. And what I mean, it's like that Timbit, nice bready, doughy. So if I choose to use wheat inside of a recipe, it'll give me that creamy complexion. And barley, certainly we're going to have some nice Scotch here later, and you'll get that nice nutty, malty, caramel type of flavor. So these are the options I get to play with as a blender. But yeah, here's your chemistry here. Yeah, I apologize for not seeing it in the back of the room. For me is why rye? Why does Canada use rye? Well, rye certainly grows in poor conditions. In fact, a lot of our rye will grow in that sandy or rocky soil or swampy soil, and rye actually won't grow past 25 degrees Celsius. I need a translation what 25 degrees Celsius is. I'm not sure what that is in Fahrenheit, but probably high 70s. But rye is the flavor, and rye is a grain that I really want to focus on is on the structure of rye and the fiber. That's the outer shell. So I got it up there in the left-hand corner, and you see that plant cell there. Fiber is actually made up of 3 components. It's actually made up of hemicellulose and cellulose. That's the big molecule there on the right-hand side. I'm going to try to figure this out here. Oh, beautiful. There you go. That's semicellulose and cellulose. Big molecule, 10,000 units. Don't have to know that. The other thing in rye is lignin. Lignin is the red component up there on the slide that envelopes and surrounds the cellulose and hemicellulose. I'll often tell to people like this, think of fiber as a brick wall. Cellulose and hemicellulose are the bricks. Lignin is the cement that holds it all together. And that's how a plant cell is constructed and together at the fiber residue. Now, why am I going on and on about fiber? It's the lignin level. If I look at that chart, and I think we have an opportunity to have online, Ewan, at the end of this, is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay, so you should be able to get a copy of this. Rye is the grain that has the highest lignin level. Okay? Why is that important? Well, there's lignin, 5,000 molecular weight, big molecule. What we like to do as distillers is heat and cook along the way. And when you do that, it breaks it apart into its building blocks. And I put up 5 compounds up there on that slide up there that are very typical that you'll see in certainly a lot of rye whiskeys. And certainly when we pot distill it, we have opportunity. I'm going to talk about pot distillation here in a second. We have opportunity to even increase the concentration of those kind of things. One of the things that drives me crazy as a blender is every time someone will say, Don, how much rye is in your whiskey? That's not the question you should be asking me. The question you should be asking me is how much 4-ethyl glycol is in my whiskey. Oh, I love it. There you go. There's 4-ethyl glycol right here. That really is the spicy component. Rye has a lot of lignin, has a lot of those compounds that we as distillers and cookers want to break it apart. And I often will say that lignin is probably one of the most unappreciated molecule in nature, especially when it comes to flavor inside a whiskey. After we ferment, for our site and our corn whiskeys, we'll ferment up to about 15% alcohol in about 3 days. And our rye, barley, and wheat fermentations will get up to about 8 to 9% alcohol. But we, as distillers, typically do this. Same thing as a bourbon industry, and I'm sure there's some bourbon producers in the audience. What we'll do is we'll take that mash and we'll put it into a column still. So I got a picture of a column still there on the right-hand side of that slide. That still happens to be 65 feet in high, 6 feet in diameter. Now, inside those stills, there are trays, totally made of copper. The simple thing is this. We take a whole grain mash, we pour it in that near the top tray, falls all the way down through the 55 trays, goes through the holes inside of the trays. At the bottom, you add steam. The simple truth is this. Alcohol's boiling point is 78 degrees Celsius, water is 100. So all the vapor of the alcohol will go out the top of the still, the dead yeast cells, the grain will go out the bottom. We'll concentrate it up to about a 70% alcohol. In the Canadian whiskey industry, we call it high wines at that point. Forget all that. That's nonsense. Forget all that. This is the easy thing to remember is this. One pass through a column still. You keep the grain flavor you're using. You keep the fruity, floral, green grass characters the yeast has made. To even back up the truck a little bit here, I kind of neglected to say this off the bat. We as fermenting whiskey, and if you want to take away anything, if you want to take anything away from the seminar, is yeast in itself makes 5 compounds, or 5 general compounds of flavor. It's fruity, floral, green grass, soapy, sulfur. I'll repeat it. Fruity, floral, green grass, soapy, sulfur. So when we pass that mash through that still, we'll keep the grain flavor, the fruity, floral, green grass, soapy notes. Which one did I miss? Where does the sulfur go? Yeah, we got a good educated group here. For those who don't, first time they've heard this, we in the industry, especially our marketing folks, they can close their ears right now. We like to put on our bottles copper distilled, copper pot distilled, copper, 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 because it's the sexy thing to do. We all use copper, and we have for 10 centuries. And it's for the purpose of salting out sulfur. And if you actually take a look at the tray here, that's supposed to be nice shiny copper. But you'll see a white residue on it. That's called copper sulfate. Okay? That's the salting out of the sulfur that the still will do. Okay? One pass through a beer still, typical what bourbon does, keeps all those flavors, makes a beautiful, beautiful spirit. But we can do one more thing. We can do this. This is called a rectifying still. We can take that spirit and run it through the still a second time, and I can make a light base whiskey for you out of rye, wheat, corn, or barley, and you can't tell the difference. There's brands of whiskey out there that could say, I have 100% rye, but if you taste it, it tastes like light base whiskey. The question you should be asking me, how was it distilled? If you single distill it, you keep all the flavor. If you double distill it through 2 column stills, you make a light base whiskey. Okay? This is one way distillers can certainly control flavor. One last thing. You can do this option if you want. You can take 1 column still, take that spirit, that 70% alcohol, has all that flavor in it, and put it into a pot still. Very simple. This one is a copper pot that we show you up there. It's just insulated for employees to work around it. But when you put it into a pot stills are very simple pieces of equipment. Very, very, very simple pieces of equipment. You slowly boil it. The very first things that come off are the green grass flavors that the yeast will make. And I have put up here, and here's your green grass flavor, and I've put their boiling points in order, all the way to the bottom, right? And it comes out in this order. Green grass characters, we take it, we cut it, we throw it away. That's the heads. Let the pot boil a little bit more, it gets warmer and warmer. What comes next is the fruity flavors the yeast has made. What comes next are the floral flavors that the yeast has made. What comes after that is the grainy characters the yeast has made, the 4-ethyl glycol. What's left into the bottom of the pot when it's very hot are the soapy flavors the yeast has made. That's the tails. We cut that and throw it away. So when we column and pot distill, we can actually concentrate up flavors. We can remove the green grass flavors and the soapy flavors the yeast has made and concentrate up the fruity, floral, and grain characters. This is the way that we can manipulate that. We know the boiling points of all these compounds that the yeast has made and or comes from the grain. It's very important to ask that question, how was it distilled? Man, I really got that radio voice. Yeah, a cigarette voice, yes. All right, we're thirsty. The very first cup in the top left-hand corner. This is Lot 40. For those who know Lot 40, it is an up-and-coming brand in Canada right now. It's our 100% rye whiskey that's been column and pot distilled. So we've concentrated up that 4-ethyl glycol during the pot distillation of this. Lot 40 is aged in brand new virgin oak barrels. This one here happens to be aged for 12 years. Typically, when we put in our rye whiskey into our pot or into our casks, it starts out at a 58% alcohol. In our Canadian climate in southern Ontario, because of the relative humidity, our spirits drops at times. So this is cask strength, 55% alcohol, Lot 40, which is going to be launched as limited release, 325 cases this fall. For those who have been waiting for cask strength Lot 40, here you go. This is going to have that nice, certainly vanilla caramel toffee notes because of the brand new virgin oak barrels, and certainly it's going to have the nice peppery notes from the rye, and certainly the fruity floral notes. I want to say, cheers,
One thing I should mention is that these tasting mats are a little bit cryptic. We're working our way down the way rather than across. So we're going to go 4 next and then go back up to the top once we get to the bottom.
Are you feeling that Canadian hug right about now? You'll notice, yeah, you'll notice on my tasting notes up there that I'll put up there, length of finish. That's not the time it takes to finish a bottle. That's the time it takes to exit the feeling in the chest, the warm feeling through the chest. This is a beautiful whiskey. It's fantastic. I already feel my throat feeling much better now. Pike Creek, Ontario. This is a creek that flows into the one of the Great Lakes that is around our distillery. I'm going to stand up here and declare this, and I'm sure somebody's going to dispute it later, and that's fine. Windsor, Ontario is one of the most unique places in the world that makes whiskey. Why? Yeah, I see the question marks over their heads. Inside of our warehouse, we got 1.6 million barrels. We got 16 warehouses. It's the size of 132 hockey rinks. I don't know what the translation is to football fields. Somebody's got to do the conversion for me. He's got the calculator out there.
Is that Olympic or NHL?
That's NHL size. That's a very Canadian question. Why the hell is Windsor, Ontario the most unique place in the world? It's because of the extreme temperature changes. Anybody live in Windsor, Matt? How hot does it get there? It gets toasty. Yeah, warmer than the rest of Canada. And it wouldn't be a stretch to be a day like today out here on the street for Windsor, Ontario. It's because of the Great Lakes. Lake St. Clair that is around us, a big body of water. It's about 15 feet deep. It heats and cools real quick. Well, inside of our whiskey aging warehouses, I don't know what I have on my next slide here. There they are there. Inside of our whiskey aging warehouses, we don't have no electricity. You put electricity inside a whiskey aging warehouse, it goes boom. So you don't have, yeah, yeah. Get the hell out, right? Why is that important? What that does, it allows barrels to expand and contract. In fact, a lot of our barrels in the winter time will drop below the freezing point of water. Thank God alcohol's freezing point is minus 40. Yeah, and that allows the barrels to breathe. And what we get over time is a loss of 3% in our whiskey aging warehouses. So if I said 1.6 million barrels, we lose 48,000 barrels a year of whiskey due to that. But we feel it really pulls in a lot of those vanilla, caramel, toffee notes that you would see in our whiskey. And that movement of whiskey in between the staves is extraordinary. We feel that adds an element to our whiskeys. But why do we want to do that? Well, here's wood again, and we're bringing up fiber. When we talked about rye grain, it's made about 12% fiber. But when we're talking about a whiskey barrel, it's made of 100% fiber, and I'm going to repeat the theme earlier. Fiber is made up of hemicellulose, cellulose, and lignin, and I've just repeated that here, and you can see these big molecules along here. And what we do as distillers, or as we want to break it apart. I always picture this. Let's picture a barrel as the game. Do you know the game Jenga? Yeah, a big Jenga tower. The building blocks is cellulose and hemicellulose and lignin. What we want to do is bust apart that tower. What's the best way to bust apart wood? If somebody can tell me the best way to bust apart wood, let me know. Fire. Fire. We burn the inside of the barrel. When you burn the inside of the barrel, this is what happens here. You can see the big molecule of lignin here. We burn it into the building blocks. You don't have to remember all this, but this is what you should remember. This is where your flavor comes from. This is where your vanilla notes come from, your caramel notes come from. You got your sweet smoky notes, you got a peanut note, you got some that sort of thing. So you're trying to bust apart wood. That's really what we're trying to do and trying to achieve as whiskey producers. Here again, hemicellulose and cellulose, want to bust it apart. And here where your caramel toffee notes come from. Caramel toffee, caramel burnt, caramel grain, caramel cardboard, caramel maple. This is where it comes from. That's where the cellulose and hemicellulose comes from. And this is what we bring into a barrel. Now, we burn barrels. What would you think? Is more fire good or more fire bad? Let's say I want to make the most vanilla caramel toffee notes as I possibly can make. Is it better to have a deeper char, or is it better to have a more narrow char? I'm hearing mixed results. Me, this is my PhD that I'm going to show you up here. When I first started my PhD, I thought, oh, more fire is good. I had the Tim the Toolman Taylor mentality. Fire, good. And it really isn't the case. So what I have here along the left-hand axis of that graph is your vanilla caramel toffee notes from the burning of a barrel. And along the bottom axis is 3 years of aging. The red line and the green line are brand new virgin oak barrels. Okay? The top one is 2 millimeters depth of burn. The second green line is 4 millimeters depth of burn. You can overburn a barrel. All right? I should have another stage on the previous slides, is that when you burn it even further, it just turns it into pure carbon. What that does is helps remove a sulfur note. So whatever sulfur note you've missed in your still, you can eliminate it by having a thick layer of char inside of your barrel. For me, when I'm designing my whiskeys, I want a 2 millimeter depth because I want as most amount of vanilla caramel toffee as I possibly can get. The third line there, the blue line, is a once used American bourbon barrel. Okay? The bottom line is a Canadian whiskey barrel that's been used over and over and over again. And Dave Broom and I just had a conversation this morning, as I'd like to dispel the myth that a barrel can get exhausted. Right? You've heard that term before, that barrels can get exhausted, but in theory, I don't think it really does. Remember going back to that Jenga tower? You got your cellulose and hemicellulose. What ends up happening is ethanol constantly picks apart the hemicellulose and cellulose and continues to make that building block. In our whiskeys, we keep reusing the barrels over and over again until it falls apart. And the discussion I had with Dave this morning about this was, a wooden desk can last for hundreds and hundreds of years. When we have whiskey barrels, they'll last maybe 40 or 50 years, whether you use them 3 times or 10 times. Alcohol will constantly pick away at a barrel. We call that ethanol lysis. The Greek word for cutting is lysis. And that's that part, this is this part of the curve here, where it slowly comes up here. Okay? That's what alcohol does. You want to pick apart the barrels either by burning it or by using alcohol itself. Alcohol is a great solvent. Okay? Whiskey number 2, or it should be number 4, the second one on your tasting mat. This one here won the world's top blended whiskey about 2 months ago in the Whiskey magazine, top blended whiskey limited release. So what I just walked through with you, I took 74 barrels to do that experiment and saw those graphs up there. So I got stuck with 74 barrels. What do I do with it all? Drink it. Well, I put it together as a blend. So this is a limited release in Ontario. Who's from Ontario here? You guys are lucky. 4 of you, 5 of you in the audience. This was a limited release in Ontario as J.P. Weiser's dissertation, and this is Dr. Donnie's PhD dissertation in a glass. So this is like opening up your refrigerator, putting all the leftovers together, and blending it together. That's exactly what we did. It's certainly a rye-forward whiskey. It's got some pot still whiskey. It's got column still whiskey in it. Very rye-forward. And the funny part about this, and I'm trying to put through the master blender's personality here, is I set the strength at 46.1 because I thought it was quite so obvious to put it at 46.1. Does anybody know why? Since we're talking about education here, the molecular weight of ethanol is 46.1. So why shouldn't the strength be 46.1? Cheers to J.P. Weiser's dissertation. Cheers. Nice. My throat's getting better. I don't know why. Certainly green apple, pear drops, orange honey is kind of what I put up there. A little less warm because there's a little bit less rye than what you saw in the Lot 40. Last thing, and then we'll hand it over here. Barrel finishing. Anybody like barrel finishing? It's a sexy thing to do, right? Barrels act like a sponge. What was in the barrel beforehand is what's going to come out into your product. And we as distillers like to do barrel finishing. Okay? What barrel finishing is this? The real word is actually called diffusion. If you really want to know, that's the science word. It's actually called diffusion. Molecules by nature need to go to equilibrium. Let's say I have a wine barrel. Let's say the green dots up there is the inside of a barrel. It's got all the wine molecules on the inside. Molecules want to move to equilibrium, and it takes about 200 days to do. So we can take a spirit aged in used Canadian whiskey barrels and then finish it off in a different type of barrel to bring in different styles of flavor. You can take a sherry barrel, obviously you're going to bring dried fruit notes into it. You can take cognac barrels, which I'd love to do someday. You can bring in almonds. We got one right now we finished in a Caribbean rum cask, and it brings in, I mean, awesome island spices. But this is some way to do it. So anyone who has got the cocktail programs out there, usually 200 days to bring it fully in, and you can have a lot of fun with it. And I'll finish off with my last whiskey here. Is this, the one in the bottom left-hand corner. This is a 10-year-old whiskey that's aged in used Canadian whiskey barrels. It's been double distilled, so it's a light base whiskey. And what we've done is we've finished it off in a barrel that's been seasoned out in the sunshine for 4 years. Sun actually degrades a barrel, breaks apart the lignin, cellulose, and hemicellulose, and gives you a unique flavor. If you really want to taste what good quality barrels really does to a whiskey without the background noise of grain or yeast flavor, this whiskey will certainly do it. This is the taste of good quality wood. This one sits at 50% alcohol because I want to emphasize that wood characteristic. I want you to look for the nice cinnamon notes, the nice vanilla caramel toffee notes, and it should shine through on this whiskey. Cheers, and thanks for listening to me.
Told you it was geeky. Another round of applause for Dr. Don. Thank you. And thanks again for explaining about busting on wood, or busting wood. I have Dr. Donny busts wood here in my notes. And Canadian hug, which please don't Google image that whilst you're in here. I just did. So, in the interests of time, I am going to move on very swiftly to our next presenter, which is Dr. Matthew Crowe, all the way from Scotland, who came specifically for this. So, a round of applause for him. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. So I'll begin. So my name, as Ewan has introduced, I'm Matthew Crowe. I am a wood scientist working for Diageo in Scotland. What I'm going to talk to you today a little bit is just about maturation, and my subheading is maturation experiments for flavour differentiation. I've got kind of like a subheading, which is what I talk about when I talk about maturation, and it's kind of hopefully give you an insight into how we understand maturation, how we kind of track maturation, and how we kind of make decisions and the different factors which come into play when we're laying down stock to use in the future. The picture here, picture here is our cooperage in the central belt of Scotland. It's called Cambus Cooperage. It's near a town called Stirling. It's a really great site. If you're ever in town, if you just come and meet me at the top of this hill here, I'll show you around. So just give me a shout. Really, very welcome. So Cambus Cooperage has been on the go for about sort of 5 or 6 years now. We treat casks there, and it's one of the kind of key processes we're going to talk about in the presentation today. So maturation and Scotch maturation. There's a really great diagram on the left here. I'm a huge fan of this picture, and it's the sort of a pictorial representation of the different flavours you get in Scotch whiskies. And when we're talking about maturation and where different flavours come from, we would say we'd probably split this flavour wheel in half across the centre line. If I can get this to work. There we go. And we would say that the flavours in the top half of the flavour wheel are more likely to come from the wood during maturation, and the bottom half are flavours are more likely to come from the distillery character, or the spirit that's come from the distillery in Scotch malt. The The other couple of boxes we've got up here as well is the second one is just some of the main variables that we deal with when we're looking at maturation. We've got the the type of distillate you're putting into casks. So at Diageo we have 28 malt distilleries, which we use for making our single malts and our blended scotches. We actually have 29. The 29th is our experimental distillery, but we don't talk about that an awful lot. You can just ask me later on, and I'll share a bit more. And we have one grain distillery at Cameron Bridge and another kind of 50% stake in another grain distillery. So all of these distilleries bring their own unique characteristics. They have a very kind of passionate and talented group of people working at each of them, trying to make sure that they have these really kind of great flavors and unique individual flavors at each of these distilleries. So what we do with maturation is we try and take these flavors and we try and focus them and we try and align them and amplify them. And we do this by putting them in casks. So maturation is obviously a really, really key process. The other factors, we have the activity of the cask you're putting it into, and we have the environment that you're maturing your cask, and we also have the amount of time that you're leaving that spirit to mature for. The third little diagram here is what we've always found is a really useful little graph for explaining maturation and what happens and what changes during maturation. It's effectively a time continuum from the left to the right, with the left-hand side being day 0 of maturation. This is when you put your new make spirit into a cask, and you put it into your warehouse, and you start the timer running. And time runs from left to right. So on day 0, you've got your new make spirit, which has lots of distillery character, which you want, which is great. And you do have some elements of immaturity and immature character, and these can be quite unpleasant characteristics. Important that they're there because they're quite often produced at the same time as the very desirable characteristics we want in our spirit. And then as time moves forward during maturation, the immaturity is lost, the distillery character is kept, and mature character builds. And mature character being wood flavour primarily, but also some other characteristics. So we would describe sort of 3 maturation mechanisms during the period of maturation. We would say there'll be the subtractive mechanism, which is the immaturity dropping away. We would say that there is the additive mechanism, which is the mature flavour increasing and wood flavour being extracted into the spirit. And then we would say there's the interactive mechanism, which is the flavour of the wood and the flavour of the distillate reacting together, reacting with oxygen, reacting with the char on the inside of the barrel. And this is probably the bit which you would say is kind of like, this is the magic happening, is the interactive part. And it's another sort of really integral part of flavour creation. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the next slide, which is the first glass that's in front of you, which is number 2 at the top of the middle column. Now, what this glass is representing for us is distillery character. So this is Cardew. It's taken from about a blend of about 40 cask samples, between sort of 30 and 35 cask samples. At 12 years old, and it was part of an experiment that I was conducting. And what we wanted to do is we wanted to take lots of different Cardew single malt, lots of different ages, from the least active casks that we could find that would still had an impact on the maturation. So we wanted really low activity casks, very little wood flavour at all, to try and really focus in on the distillery characteristic and how it developed during time. I'm a huge fan of this whiskey. I think it's really great because even though it's been a low activity cask, it's nothing like a new make spirit. It's got a lot of fruity characteristics and really quite unusual. I think before today I would have suggested that maybe 12 or 15 other people on this planet had smelt this whiskey. Now we've got another 175 on top of that. So it's a very rare opportunity to try something as unusual as this. The graph which we've put on the right-hand side here, this is the colour, and as you may have noticed in the cup in front of you, it's a very pale whiskey. Now, we use colour as a measure of what the activity of that cask has been like. So, as Don mentioned, the colour of whiskey, whether it's Scotch or Canadian or American, will come from the wood and come from the fabric of the wood as it's broken down. The glass that you have in front of you is taken from the open dots at the bottom here. Now, these were all very low activity casks, very low colour from them. Just for a comparison, as part of the same trial, we sampled some bourbon casks, which had held Cardew for 3 years. And at 3 years, they were already 2 or 3 times more colour extracted into them. So in spite of 12 whole years of maturation, there was still very, very little colour coming to these, which was absolutely perfect for the experiment that we were doing, because we were wanting to see how that flavour changed. There's no immaturity left in this. I hope you agree. There's no immaturity left in this spirit. But at the same time, there's very little wood flavour in there either. It's a very unusual whiskey to be quite so kind of crisp and balanced. And when we were discussing it and tasting it, we talked a lot about the kind of fruity characteristic. There's sort of red apples, soft fruit and berries. And there's a very, very unusual note for Cardew, which is it's almost a sort of like black curranty kind of note, which is almost hoppy. For me, is almost like a very sort of lightly hopped characteristic. Now, what we use the colour measurement for is it gives us an indication of what we should do with that cask next. So if we'd disgorged these casks to use to bottle them, we would measure the colour of the spirit that's coming out of these casks, and then we would make a call about whether or not we should use that cask again. These ones being of such low colour, we would argue that the next maturation would be even slower than the one we found with this whiskey. So we wouldn't actually take these and fill them again. What we would do is we would take them and we would put them through a process called rejuvenation, which is a little bit more on the next slide. So rejuvenation is the way that we reactivate casks after they've been through their sort of lifetime of maturations. And this would be maybe 4 or 5 fills for Scotch whisky. And we would describe them as exhausted, and that we wouldn't use them again because we wouldn't think they would give the desired characteristics for the next maturation. So we would take the cask, we scrape the inside surface to remove the wood, which has no flavour left to give. It takes the char away as well. And then we would reburn these casks. So we would, through the burning process, we would put a toasted layer into the woods, create lots more flavour again, and then leave it with a charred layer on the surface, because the char is very important for us as well in that subtractive maturation and taking away any immature characteristics. So glass number 5, moving down the way. Glass number 5 is another experimental spirit. This was an experiment that was started about 18 years ago. I wasn't with the company 18 years ago, but when I started 10 years ago, one of the jobs I was given was reviewing old experiments and looking at some of the casks which were in warehouse and sort of squirreled away, and they're on a list, someone's list, and no one was really touching them because they're part of an experiment. So I got a really amazing job of going and reviewing all of these casks and drawing samples from them and having a look at them. So one of the experiments I looked at was this experiment, and the idea behind it was to take rejuvenated casks, or recharred casks, and put brand new American oak ends into them. And these were with a heavy a heavy char on these ends. So lots and lots of wood flavour going into them. And I'll be honest, I can't even remember what they were trying to do with the experiment, but they were trying to push flavour in different directions. And one of them was really focusing on that American oak richness. So when I looked at these casks about 8 or 9 years ago, we all agreed as a tasting panel and individually that it wasn't very good. The wood had completely overwhelmed the spirit character. The Glenoid, it's Glenoid spirit, Glenoid's a really great single malt, was lost in amongst all of the wood characteristics. It was too spicy, it was too harsh. So we left them in the warehouse where they were and kind of forgot about them again. And then very recently, 2-3 months ago, again, we were reviewing some of the experimental casks which are out there. So we brought in some more samples. And that's what you have in front of you just here in glass number 5. And what we found was, 8-9 years further down the line, the wood flavour had really mellowed and softened, and it actually allowed the distillery character within there to sort of reassert itself a little bit. So you can actually, you can find the distillery character in there. So rather than it just being completely wood flavour, for me, there's still that green, sort of crisp Glenoid character in there, and there's some sort of rich kind of dark berry notes as well, which are quite characteristic of Glenoid. So for me, a really great example of an experiment which didn't really seem to be working or didn't really seem to be giving us what we wanted at the time. And then a fresh pair of eyes a few years later, come back and look at it and found something which was really quite unusual and quite nice, quite unique. So this is drawn from about 30 cask samples within a trial of about, I think there was between 300 and 400 casks put into this trial. Which was a really great nosing and tasting session, I'm sure you can imagine. So the Glenoid characteristics, so there's a lot of these kind of dark berry notes, and if any of you know the single malt, which is the Singleton of Glenoid, it's actually uses quite a lot of European oak barrels, butts within there, and a lot of that's down to the way that the European oak rich fruits complement the sort of dark berry notes which come through in Glenoid really well. And that's sort of one of like the overriding sort of like ideas and ethos behind a lot of the single malts we create is about striking the correct balance between the wood characteristics and the distillery characteristics. So the next slide we've got is talking about Oban Little Bay, which is glass number 8. Now, Oban Little Bay came out of a series of discussions about how we could take the Oban single malt, some really fantastic single malt, lots of really interesting green kind of oily characteristics, but it's quite a subtle single malt. And we discussed a lot about how we could differentiate the flavour within Oban, add some new flavours and change it up a little bit. And we were really keen on trying to do a European oak style with the Oban. But we found it really overwhelmed the Oban characteristic a lot of the time. So when we started developing Little Bay, we brought in lots and lots of different cask samples, and we were looking at refill casks, so more like the first style, which was the Cardu in the first glass. We brought in lots of recharred, these rejuvenated casks, like in the second glass, and looked at the different flavours that were being pulled through and highlighted by that maturation. And then we were looking at the European oak butts with Oban mature in them. And we started to put these together and started to look at ways to combine these flavours and to make something that was very balanced and very interesting. So Little Bay, for me, with the butts and the European oak butts in there, there's lots of rich fruit, but there's still this really kind of like crisp, green, oily character, a little bit like olive oil, kind of like green olives. And then there's a bit of vanilla and spice from the rejuvenated cask. But there's quite a lot of subtlety in there. It's complex, it's very rich. And the last sort of stage of the process in development is we wanted to bring back a kind of like an older technique of marrying. So we wanted to take these casks, we emptied the casks, we put them together, and then we ran all of the spirit back into barrels. And these were extremely low activity barrels. They were basically, there was no flavour left to give from them. There was no char, there was no subtractive maturation going on, no additive maturation. And all we wanted was to take all of these flavours and let them marry together and mellow and soften. And over the course of a few months, this made a really big difference to the way that these flavours all came together. And I hope you agree, a really nice spirit, the Little Bay. Is any kind of comments in the room about any flavors that were coming through on the Little Bay? Is it something that people have tried before? People are nodding.
Hands up, who's tried it before?
It's the back of the room.
We've still got some work to do.
So for Little Bay, I mean, the way I would describe Little Bay is it's a very modern single malt. The thought process, the ethos of it, the way we used science to understand the maturation makes it a very modern single malt. But using the marrying process, a very traditional process, and obviously the way that the single malt was produced at the distillery is very traditional process. So it's a real kind of like balance between using science and technology, using chemistry to make new flavors and to differentiate flavors, but while still keeping a very traditional product and a very traditional process that's in there. And I hope over the last kind of like 10-15 minutes or so, through the three glasses that we've discussed, we kind of illustrated the way we think about maturation, the way we use maturation, and some of the choices and some of the different processes that we can use to drive different flavors. And thank you very much for listening.
All right. How good was that Glenoid? Delicious.
Thank you.
Are we going to get to see that over here, Matthew?
I think this might be the only appearance of that Glenoid over here.
Oh.
Sorry.
We give, and then we take it away.
I think that might be the only appearance of this Cardew over here. But the Cardew 12-year-old will be. I'm sure that'll be available somewhere, Ewan.
Okay, wonderful. So before I pass on to our final presenter, we had some questions sent in, so I'm just going to shoot a couple of those, and then we're going to do some more Q&A at the end. So if anyone wants to field one of these. Question here, do you have any failed experiments that you would like to share? Anyone? Bueller?
I would argue, so my PhD, my background in academia was in chemistry. I'd argue there's no such thing as a failed experiment because you tend to always learn something. I know many people who've done PhDs when they've not actually had a single successful experiment in the whole period that they've been studying and researching, but they've learned a lot along the way and they've managed to write it up. So everything we've done, every experiment I've ever conducted has always had something interesting come out of it, even if it's not exactly what you set out to find. There's usually something interesting comes out of it.
Okay, another question here. Have you ever worked on a project that you have liked and that everyone else has hated?
Okay. I think that I suppose the question actually it leads into a really interesting area, which is the fact that when I was blending, when I was a Johnny Walker blender, I was part of a blending team, and not everyone always sings from the same hymn sheet. Not everyone always agrees. So there tends to be quite, how would I phrase it, robust discussions about the flavors that people are experiencing. Everyone has different experience of flavor, and everyone describes things in slightly different ways. So there will certainly be, I could imagine many occasions where people would disagree quite strongly about whether something is great, good, or not. But at the end of the day, people tend to understand where the others are coming from. So the answer is yes. I've made lots of whiskies people haven't liked and I've thought were amazing, and I've disagreed strongly, and they've usually won, been outvoted.
Okay.
I mean, from my side on the tasting, I don't produce the stuff in cognac. I'm not that old, but they, not that they are, but in the launch of our H250, which was to celebrate our 250th anniversary in 2015, it was left to me to decide which glass to drink it out of, and the importance of the glass really came down to what notes did we want to accentuate within it. And it was a very hard day at work. I sat there with about 20 different Riedel glasses and H250 and in the cafeteria in the heart of the office in New York, and everybody else walked by from all the other producers in our company, and they're like, oh, Jourdan's working hard. But the choice was made to go with the Riedel XO glass versus some other ones, and in the reverse, I personally thought it tasted better out of a Reposado glass because it accentuated the floral notes in the Reposado glass, whereas Riedel produced an XO glass for Hennessy about 20 years ago, and the XO glass, as you might expect from if anyone's had Hennessy XO, it's very bold, very spicy. It's largely new oak, so it accentuated the spicy notes, and I thought the cognac lent itself better to the floral notes, but I was outvoted.
Okay.
So try it out of
Well, there's
both.
that. Don, do you have anything?
A failed experiment turns into vodka. No, we were kind of having this discussion earlier. We have the luxury at the distillery where I work at is that our vodka's good, by the way. I don't know what that's good about. We do have the luxury, and it comes back to maybe emphasizing the point where I made earlier that the question you should be asking is not what grain it's made from, but how it was distilled. So there are means and ways for experiments like that. Is the worst case scenario for us, it turns into a vodka or a base whiskey spirit where you can pull out certain things. I recall a number of years ago where I tried to finish some base whiskey inside of a beer barrel. It just did not turn out correct for a number of reasons. I think one of the things, if you want to finish whiskey in a beer barrel, you got to do it right away. Beer is open to oxidation, right? And you're getting that trans to noniol, which is a cardboard. That's that pizza box. If anyone's been to a frat party and that smell in the room and the next morning when you passed out, that's that pizza box smell. If you don't fill a barrel that once had beer and with whiskey, I find that's what you're going to get into it. Again, it's a learning. It's absolutely learned, and we did learn that. So if anyone wants to try that experiment, fill the barrel immediately. Innovate, try new things. I mean, my dream someday is you come and visit my distillery and you can make your own blended whiskey. You pull out, I want this much barley or this much aged or this much barrel type. And I think everybody's tastes are different. Tasting notes drive me nuts. I don't like them. To be honest with you, who am I to tell you you're going to taste a strawberry in my whiskey, or who am I to tell you that I'm going to taste a whatever in my whiskey? In my distillery, I'm responsible for Malibu rum. Personally, I can't smell coconut. I can't smell coconut. I just can't. Sensory notes are like eye color. You're only given the gifts you're given. Doesn't matter whether you're male, female, old, young, smoker, non-smoker. It doesn't matter. And one of the questions, I know you're going to preempt me on that, is about sensory analysis. That's the most important test we do as distillers. It's the people choosing, deciding every day, day to day, nosing your whiskey. We got a group of people that are very trained and they're very sensitive. We know what they're sensitive to, and I think that's the most important thing. People choose what's going out in the marketplace, and I can speak probably for your distillery. It's up to the individuals that work there and that are great craftsmen for it. Sorry for taking up your time. Yeah.
No problem. Thank you. All right. And we're running almost exactly on time, which is a novelty for me. So let's keep going with that. And I'm going to introduce our last presenter, and possibly the best dressed as well, Jourdan Bushell from Hennessy. Round of applause.
When you work for a company whose initials are Louis Vuitton, LVMH, you tend to have to in case the French team shows up and they have Louis Vuitton discounts. So you don't want to not show up dressed. My name is spelled correctly despite the red line under it, but Hennessy is spelled incorrectly. There is not an extra E on the end. That's the pub.
We had corrected that. I don't know why it reverted back. Sorry. That's my fault.
So we've heard a lot about whiskey, and I think if you like whiskey, you'll also like cognac. Are there any, well, let's quick poll, are there any cognac drinkers in this room? Perfect. That's great. We're going to talk about a lot of the differences and how we influence it, because cognac starts at its core as a grape, which is very different than most of the stuff on the back bar is grain-based. And the grape is influenced by terroir a great deal. Hennessy pulls from the original 4 growing regions within cognac. That's Grand Champagne, Petit Champagne, Borderie, and Fimbois. I'm not going to touch too much on those, but leave it that they influence the grape in a great way, and oftentimes you can tell the style of a cognac based on where it's from, because that's going to help dictate how to treat it or how to get the best out of it. So in cognac, though we're going to talk a lot about the science, there are no definitives. There's only generalities. We know in general what something is going to do, and yet it's only through tasting and continually tasting it that we discover how it's reacting to all the elements we put through it. But at its very core, that grape is going to change year in and year out. Every year, the same vine might produce something slightly different. And when you're talking about distillation, at its very core is concentration. The fun bit is concentrating the alcohol. What we're trying to get is the concentration of flavor. It takes 9 bottles of wine to make 1 bottle of eau de vie, the distillate that we're then going to age. That's a huge concentration of wine, and we're going to taste that through all of this. So when we talk about the aging, that is something where we start with the grape, and those individual eau de vie are going to tell us what story they want to tell, and it's up to us to read into that and recognize it. To do that, at Hennessy, we have a tasting committee led by our master blender. To be on that tasting committee, much as Don said, it's a very distinguished group of craftsmen. It takes 10 years of sitting there in silence and learning from everybody that's come before. Our master blender, Jan Fidu, just retired July 1st. He was the 7th generation. He's passed it down to his nephew Renaud for the 8th generation. Renaud's been working with him on the tasting committee for 14 years, but that does not include his 10 years in silence. I could never be on this committee because I can't not talk for 10 years. So, as much as I would like to. Some of the things we're influencing, and the top here we have damp cellars and we have dry cellars. Our traditional cellars are damp cellars. These are the humid cellars. These are often closest to bodies of water, such as the Charente River, and or at the base of hills where there's a lot of water runoff. These have natural clay floors or dirt floors, whereas our dry cellars they're more modern in cognac. They've been used for the last 60 years. These are newer to us. A drier cellar is going to be greater evaporation, which we'll talk about in a second. But because of the greater influence of the Angel's share and the heat in the area, we're having about 2/3 to 3/4 of our total inventory. So a lot of our younger cognacs are going to go through the dry cellar, whereas most of our older cognacs are all in the damp cellars. Our oldest cellars date back to 1774, and they're all damp cellars. But the important thing or the interesting thing is the slides below that, or the points below that, category A, B, C, D, and E barrels. So a lot of people equate barrel aging, and I've heard it done before, and many of you have probably heard it, equating it to the making of tea. When you use a brand new barrel, it's like using a fresh tea bag. You're getting the strong tannic flavors out. The same is true of barrels. Though they say, 30 years, and then it's, what did you say? Exhausted. But we can all agree that there's fall off. So there's a significant amount of fall off year after year. So when we look at a category A barrel, this is not the quality of the barrel. We use all high quality French Limousin oak, but a category A barrel is for the first 12 months of use. That's a huge amount of extraction. A brand new oak barrel is like a predator. If you don't put the right thing in it, it can overtake it. It can destroy any soft or subtle notes. So it has to be the right eau de vie to go into that barrel, and we'll talk about that in a second. Category B is from 2 to 4 years of use. Category C, 5 to 9 years of use. Category D, 9 to 20, and category E, 20 to 35, and what some people would then say is that exhausted stage, but you still get some benefit out of that. Important to look at category C. At 5 years old, there's only 40% left of extractable flavors and tannins. That's fall off. And that's when you're looking at the color, when you're looking at the flavor, but what's still happening in those barrels is the concentration, the angel share, so the concentration of the flavors that are already there, whether those are the extractable tannins and flavors from the barrel and or the base spirit itself. But when you look at category D barrel, it's at the 9-10 year mark, 10% left of extractable flavors and tannins. And yet we say 30 years is neutrality. So going into the 20-year marks, you're a fraction of a percentage, but it's still about the time and the maturity. And a few of us have set it up here. It's not, time is one thing. Maturity is something vastly different. As my mother says, you can get older, you're just not going to get more mature unless you're babied along. That's what we have to worry about in the barrel. It's not about that age statement. It's about when it reached that maturity, when it reached the flavors. And some can be not that desirable, and then all of a sudden you let them go longer and they get more desirable. So with that in mind, number 3 at the top, the one without the plastic cup on it, this isn't a fancy glass. Please leave these glasses. I need them for later. Somebody on my brand team will kill me if I lose all of these. I think they almost had a heart attack when I said I need 600. And it's all because the last one in front of you, we don't drink out of anything but this glass. So we'll get to that. But this is a Fimbois 4-year-old seasoned oak. So when we say seasoned oak, this is a category D barrel. So this is the 10% extractable flavors and tannins. This is not ready to blend. This is not something that we would blend into a cognac. This is not something we would make cognac out of yet. Fimbois generally reaches its maturity younger. Fimbois has up to 60% clay in the soil. So the effect on that grape is going to be, in this you're going to taste the minerality. That minerality would go away and turn into red fruit when this reached maturity. Red fruit is the common note from Fimbois that we'll get in glass number 2 that is a blended cognac. But 4-year-old single EDV, this is going to be in the dry cellars. So that slight acidity and minerality, that is from an immature cognac. Those are going to go away as this matures over time. And here's the tasting notes. But I would agree, to each their own. Everybody grew up differently. Everybody tasted different things growing up. A flower bush in their front yard at their parents' house. All affected your taste buds today. So you're all going to taste different things. So please taste everything and make up your own minds for it. This we have to play. And I know we've all seen a still, but I'm going to talk to you about the effects that cognac has and when we cut. And this will relate to a slide next on the chemical breakdown within the cuts within the cognac. So we start with the wine, and one of the things you see right there, that is uncommon to other stills because that is used in cognac. That's a wine warmer. So the wine will go through the still, pass through the wine warmer to heat the wine for the next batch, to preheat it so that we don't have to collect more fuel. When it's going to condense, it's going to come out at 3 ways. We know heads and tails, and in the heart is the bruit. We start with a 6 to 9% alcohol wine. We're aiming for around 8 to 9% alcohol. The bruit comes out at about 32%. So the second distillate is the bruit. Now, based on the flavor of that bruit when it comes out after the first distillate, every grape is different. So every time we have to adjust. We're going to cut proportionate amounts of heads and tails back into the wine to alter each distillate every time. So the end distillate, we're getting 4 things. The heads, the coeur, which is French for heart. Then we have the seconds and the tails. So the cut of the heads is anything above 72.4% alcohol. And then at the coeur starts at 72.4 by law. It goes down to 60%, and then the seconds start. Now, we'll see a very fancy chart that will show those cuts, but the seconds, the choice of the heads and tails, we're going to cut those back into the wine as well, the rest of the wine from this field, this batch, in proportionate amount based on flavors. So we can get every chemical analysis done we want, but at the end of the day, we need somebody there tasting it, because it comes down to that taste. and cutting it. And so we know what's happening, and innovation and analysis has helped in that and helped us understand what's happening throughout the years. But at the end of the day, it's always important to have a taste. We could automate this process, and we could get it there, but we could make good cognac through automation. We could never make great cognac because each grape is different. So we have to taste every time, and the choices are made based on that taste. The seconds, there's two choices. You could cut this back into the wine, but because we feel it's almost there, that would, to Hennessy, that is too much of a distillate. That would make a much more neutral cognac in the end. At Hennessy, we cut the seconds back into the bruit to only pass by one more time to get to the final distillate. So when you're looking at these charts with all the chemicals on it, the important thing is where you see these cuts happening. So when we look at isomal acetate, it's going to, and this is distillation on lees, by the way. So the lees is the spent yeast cells. So much like everyone in this room, yeast is not immune to alcohol. It is tolerant to alcohol, which if anybody went out at Alibi till 4 in the morning, you've probably realized very harshly this morning. But with the lees, with distillation on lees, this is not a law in cognac, but this is something that we do. And this second one we're going to taste is a great example of what the lees can do. So the lees, when the alcohol reaches a certain thing, we all know it dies. But in wine, when left in the wine to distill, it's difficult to distill that way because it's particulate matter in the still, and it could burn. And if it burns, it's going to ruin the eau de vie. It's going to produce bitter and off notes. But when done properly, you get up to 250% more, and often in a lot of cases, of these isomal acetates, of the phenol 2 alcohols, and the isobutanol. It's a massive increase in the flavor. At Hennessy, we like to say we make bold cognacs. That would be the marketing speak, but it's because of this. We're looking for the enhanced wine flavor, and the yeast is bringing out a lot of, when you look at the isomal acetate, it's bringing out those kind of banana notes, and it's a natural thing that happens in the banana skin. Then you're looking at the phenol 2 alcohol has got a lot of the rose. It appears naturally in everything from carnation, rose, hyacinth, neroli, and magnolia. So it's appearing in flowers naturally. That's why we're getting floral notes in cognac. That's why we get floral notes in the distillate. So as we taste them, these are going to come out. The barrel is another element that's adding to it, but in the distillate, we're already getting this, and we want to concentrate this through the lees, but through that distillation when done properly. Any questions on that? So the second one, this is not available anymore. And if you find this anywhere, I would buy it. This was the limited edition last year, Master Blender Selection number 1. And so when our committee gets together and tastes every day between 11 and 1, sometimes they find outliers, the eau de vie that have gone away from the flavors that they were looking for anything like Hennessy VS, Hennessy Black, VSOP, XO. This was an experiment with a highly concentrated amount of lees. So what the lees is going to do to this, other than that flavor enhancement, is that long finish. This is going to sit on your palate a very, very, very long time. This was put in category B barrels, and the interesting thing from that is most of the time, a high level of lees such as this would be reserved for a much older cognac. It would be reserved for anything above XO. We're talking 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 years or more would have that high level of lees, something like Grand and Petit Champagne that's going to need a long time to reach that maturity, and then we want that long lingering finesse to it. In this case, it's only 5 to 15 years old in the blend, and the average in this is going to be 8, 9, 10 years old. When they're doing a blend within cognac, it's kind of like a pyramid. The heart of that blend, there's a range of 5 to 15, but that heart in the middle is the most amount of the eau de vie, and there's elements of the younger ones and elements of the older ones to accentuate different flavor compounds within it. So the other thing with cognac or it's different for us than a lot of the aged spirits out there is we're using wide grain oak. So this is pedunculate oak versus Cecile oak. Wide grain being the rings on the tree. It's about 2 to 2.5 millimeters between the rings versus 1 to 1.5 within the Cecile. But it is a higher level of tannin within this oak. We enjoy it because of the flavor breakdown. There's where one flavor falls off, another flavor joins it. So Limousin oak is very important to us. We use 100% Limousin oak across the board, but on a molecular level, it's smaller pores. So though it's wider grain, it's a smaller pore to the extraction level there. So this is 80 to 100 EDV within this. This is about 50% Fimbois, which was the first sample we had, was Fimbois. Then there's going to be elements of Grand and Petit Champagne and a little bit of Borderie. And here are the flavor notes. But what is interesting about this to me is the long finish and the spice sitting at the back of your throat. So, the angel's share. When we talk about, and I would agree completely that a barrel is not exhausted. It still has a lot of benefit, and it's something that cognac has understood for a very long time, because even with very little extraction, you're still getting angel's share and the concentration. And the first concentration of the wine is through distillation. The second concentration of the wine is through the angel's share. So even though you may not be extracting as much or as in high proponents, you're still getting the concentration of what is already been extracted and the base, wherever those grapes came from, and extracting or concentrating those flavors. So when we look at some of the decisions the tasting committee is going to make is based on what cellar that's going to go into. So really, again, when somebody's asking about what goes in it, how old it is, no, that doesn't matter. It's really about how it was treated that entire time. You know, where it came from may dictate how it's treated. How it's distilled may be dictated by where it came from, and will dictate the potential of what it has to do later on. So in this, you cannot you cannot age Hennessy VS longer and get VSOP. You cannot age VSOP longer and get XO. They're all distinctly their own. The age statement idea or that one region is better than another within the terroir or the growing regions within cognac is a ridiculous idea. They each have their own characteristics that are going to lead to differences. And if you just have one over another, then you're limiting yourself, and why would you do that? We look at the damp cellar, and this would seem to a lot of people to be a very, very small angel's share at 0.5% or even under to sometimes 0.2, but all our oldest stuff goes in there. So anything at 50 years old or more is in our damp cellars or our humid cellars, what we would call even our founder cellar. And at 50 years, they will go into larger barrels at 550, or sometimes go into larger barrels, 550 torchons. So that's smaller surface area. But at 50 years, there's less volatile compounds, so there's going to be less evaporation at that time as well. Whereas the dry cellar, you can get up to 4%. The average in cognac is about 2%, which is a loss in overall cognac of 27 million bottles of cognac a year. And close to half of that is from Hennessy. Yes. So when talking about these, when we talk about the distillation and cutting heads and tails back in, I mean, those are some of the dangerous notes that, in bad moonshine make you go blind. I hear it's only for like 24 hours though, so, drink up. But those are going to evaporate. The safety is the angel share. Some of those volatile compounds, they're going to be the first to evaporate anyway, leaving behind the flavors that we want and the more stable compounds. So you're going to get, thus when aging first started, it was considered desirable. All of a sudden, yes, we're getting color. Oh, yes, it's getting better. But that was why, that it made even bad distillates taste better over time. So this is probably the largest tasting of Paradis Imperial ever done. The Maison says, I had to do something, I'm not a doctor. So The Maison says we shouldn't taste this with more than 3 people. So I'm going to take a photo later, and if 172 of you could hide to the left side, that would be great. But this is an example of what happens when you age in very, very seasoned oak barrels. This would only see category D barrels and above. This is 30 to 130 years old. I'll let that sink in for a second. Hold on, can I just drop this? No. We call this a modern cognac because through the years of creating cognac, through the many generations of creating it, there are many experiments, and this was one of them, was what happens when we age it in very seasoned oak. Hennessy created the world's first XO in 1870, and that was the first idea of oak really not overpowering, but being very dominant over that of the grape and changing those grape notes into more fig or date. This is the reverse of that, with the understanding that, well, let's concentrate the grape notes. And so with that category D barrel, you're getting very little extraction. You can look at the color on this at 130 years old. If you had any spirit in close to a young barrel at 130 years old, we would taste tannin and oak at this point. It would be overaged for what it is. In this case, it's the interaction between the grape and the barrel that allows us to do something like this. So I'm going to let you just enjoy this for a second, because the aging on lees is also going to be in there, or the distillation on lees for that very, very long finish. And this is largely Grand Champagne, Petit Champagne, because they've been aged for long enough to reach their potential. There's very little, if any, Fin Bois in here. You don't get a lot of that red fruit, but you do, and maybe a little bit of Borderie. Tasting notes. The interesting thing for this, I will say, of one tasting note, not to guide your palates, but the tasting committee was very impressed with the bright ginger note on the back end within this, and for something to be this old and have that bright ginger note, and with a lot of that saffron in there, was something very interesting to them and something very unique. So cheers.
Cheers.
Cheers. Cheers.
How delicious was that? That's incredible, right? All right, I'm getting the dreaded 5 minutes card at the back from Spencer, so we're gonna try and hustle this one up. Does anyone have any questions? Yes, Liz Rhodes.
Each of you guys mentioned sensory being a key piece. How do you find chemistry, since this is a chemistry seminar, linking up with that sensory? And do you ever find that chemistry disagrees?
Who'd like to field that one? None of them, obviously.
First of all, that's a very good question. I don't know if I can answer it personally, but I do find chemistry does link up to sensory analysis. For us, when we train our panelists, we'll buy the chemicals that I've shown on my slide individually, put it in neutral grain spirit, and train them up that way. I will say in our panelists too, we do train them, and we know their sensitivity level. And that's where I know I can't smell coconut, whereas people can. So we will do that. I cannot stress enough. We'll have $500,000 of GC mass specs in our facility. At the end of the day, it is the people that decide what gets released. I don't know if you guys want to add to that.
I think they do line up. And there are times, though, when we're distilling, before we distill the wine, they'll taste the wine and make decisions on the wine from the flavor versus any kind of analysis done. And the best of them are not analyzed, because we want to, before we get the analytics back on it, it could have changed as a wine. So we'll distill it before we get the analytics. So the entire decision is made on the palate of these experts and this passed down knowledge, so that they can distill it before it changes. And if we waited for the analysis, it would have changed in that time.
Yeah,
Sir, guy in the hat.
I was just going to say, I would just agree with what's been said. Yeah, the analysis definitely supports the sensory. I think from training purposes, the knowledge of the compounds that are critical in certain flavours is really, really beneficial. But as was said, at the end of the day, it's always the sensory sign-off at the end of it. There's a nose and there's a taste, and that's the tick in the box. That's the yes or the no.
Yes, this gentleman here.
Along the same line, so do you know what the chemicals are that give the taste of coconut?
Yes, I do. Yep. Yeah, inside of whiskey, they're the cis and trans whiskey lactones, if you want a coconut kind of perception. And I know I'm not very good at those notes, quite honestly. But yeah, that gives you that coconut feel, and that comes from the actually oil resins from the wood.
I think we have time for one more question. This gentleman here.
Don, you had mentioned that grain bill, mash bill isn't as important as aging or the distilling process. Is the same true for grape varietals?
I would stop at the very first state. No, I think grain is very important. It depends on the way you distill it.
But is grape varietal the same?
Is grain varietal? Grape? I have no idea. I don't distill grapes.
It's.
I could comment on grain varietal if you want, and the answer is yes.
So it would be the same. It helps guide the decisions on how it's done, but we ultimately pull from the 4 regions for a reason. Some of them, they're going to bring different things to a blend, so the end spirit benefits by having more flavor from, or more diverse flavor from all 4 regions than just pulling from one or another. We find it more interesting to pull from all of them and have that blend. Does that answer the question? Yeah, perfect.
Awesome. All right, I'm going to wrap this up now. But before I let you guys all go, first of all, I'd like to say some thank yous. The wonderful people at the back of the room are our CAP team. I'd love them to get a huge round of applause.
Sorry for giving you all the glassware. My bad.
And the other thing I would like to say is that a seminar, when you write it, is just that. It's just a concept. It's just an idea. And it's the people and the talent who come and speak, who fill the air and also bring the liquid, who make it a success. Easy for me to say. So I'd like a huge round of applause for our panel. Thank you very much. And that's it. Thank you very much.